So I thought I would start today by talking through the three big picture questions that my clients have asked me when considering adopting trust-based practices and principles. And these also reflect some of the questions that we got in advance. So there are these. Number one, is trust-based philanthropy something you can do consistent with legal requirements? Obviously, that's a key question. Second, how do I balance accountability with these principles? And then third, what risks does trust-based philanthropy create for my board and my organization? So let's take it from the top. Can I engage in trust-based philanthropy in a way that's consistent with legal requirements? And the short answer, I would say, is yes. As we'll get into further, trust-based philanthropy isn't about blindly trusting grantees that you barely know, or doling out money willy-nilly. And I think it says, I heard Pia Infante say, it's not just leaving a pile of money in the middle of the road and seeing what happens. And it isn't also about eliminating contracts or grant agreements, although in certain circumstances that could be possible. And it's also not about having less accountability in your grant making. What I think it's really about is, it's about showing up differently in the practice of philanthropy with the values that Shadi described underlying the work, leading with trust rather than suspicion, engaging and collaborating with grantees with humility and curiosity, and acknowledging that no one has all the answers, which is become all too apparent during these times. And then achieving the goals through listening and collaborating and prioritizing open and healthy relationships with grantees, where they're comfortable being vulnerable with funders about what hasn't worked, so that you can work together to support what does work. And consciously thinking about how to share and cede power to grantee partners and communities who are closer to the issues you're trying to address. And also just being conscious of the systemic inequity, both in the philanthropic relationship, but also in greater society, so that we can work to change practices and behaviors that might perpetuate harm. And as a lawyer, as I think about these values and these practices, I've really concluded that none of these values is inconsistent with the legal rules that foundations have to abide by. And I'm going to go through those more specifically later. Certainly, there are some requirements that foundations do have to abide by under the tax code and state nonprofit laws, but I don't think they're fundamentally at odds with the trust-based values that we are talking about today. And we'll definitely go into that further. Another big question we've gotten is, how do I balance accountability with these principles? And again, I think there is nothing in the principles and values that says don't hold your grantees accountable. I think the question is really more, how are you going to hold grantees accountable? Or what do you think your accountability measures help you achieve? And I think about it some similar ways as I am thinking about parenting my teenager this summer during a pandemic. How am I going to hold him accountable for having a somewhat productive summer? Am I going to do it by requiring him to complete a daily checklist of activities, reporting to me on his checklist completion, and then having dire consequences of cutting him off screen time if he doesn't complete everything on the list? Or is it by having a dialogue with him about what he wants to accomplish this summer, setting some goals and structure collaboratively with him, and then checking in with him periodically to see how it's going on, what's working, what's not working, and hopefully knowing we've got to adjust expectations perhaps somewhere along the line, and mutually, hopefully driving towards our shared goal of him not having a totally wasted summer. Similarly, I think with grantors and grantees, it doesn't mean not having anything on the back end or along the way to see what's being done with your grant dollars. But I think it's imagining new ways of doing this that's less paper intensive, less about checking the box, and more about relationship building, collaboration, and mutual learning. So perhaps there are more check-in phone calls and conversations with grantees about how things are going, and having them submit fewer written reports into the Salesforce system that no one reads, but they are required to be submitted before the next grant installment can be paid. Or as one of my clients who engages in a lot of local place-based funding says, I don't really need a written report. When I walk through town and talk to community members and grantees, I can see the progress that's being made with our grant funds with my own two eyes. So, and also, as I've been working on this, if you do want to have some sort of written report, making sure that the metrics that you're asking grantees to report on are ones that the grantee really thinks are the right ones to measure their work by. I recall working at a youth development program on the Lower East Side in New York a long time ago, and a funder really wanting us to collect report cards from all of our program participants so they could track our program's potential impact on the participants' grades. And the funder not realizing what a difficult ask that was, with many of our kids coming from broken homes and coming to our program as a refuge, and where our program's impact on their grades was really not what we were focused on. And then I recall the funder being very angry with us when we couldn't deliver the report cards. So, I mean, certainly your foundation may have a specific theory of change that it wants to measure, but, I think these principles perhaps ask us to think about, does this really line up with the grantee's goals? And also to make sure that your accountability measures are not, in fact, hampering your grantee's ability to do their work. So again, I don't think the practices and principles are inconsistent with accountability, but perhaps it's changing the way that accountability is accomplished between funder and grantee in a more mutually beneficial way that's focused on dialogue and a deep effort to understand what does and doesn't work, and investing in the grantee's success that ultimately hopefully moves the work forward for everyone. And the final opening question is, what risks does trust-based philanthropy create for my board and my organization? So I think this is an interesting question. And some of it depends on what risks you're thinking that you really need to protect people, protect your organization and board against. So I guess starting with the board, your board members are fiduciaries of the organization, of your foundation, which means they're keepers of the organization's mission. And they're also stewards of the finances to make sure the funds are used to achieve your mission. So they generally have to exercise 3 fiduciary duties under state law. The duty of care, which means they have to show up, pay attention to the organization's operations and finances, and to try to make decisions that other prudent people in their situation would make. They also have to abide by the duty of loyalty, which means they have to act solely in the best interests of the foundation when making decisions for the foundation and recusing themselves from conflicts of interest situations. And then there's the duty of obedience, which means they should ensure that the organization is staying faithful to its mission and to compliance with laws. So in short, the board has to exercise care in making decisions for the organization that are in the best interest of the organization and help to ensure that your foundation's funds are used in a way that furthers and propels your mission. And if you're a grant-making foundation, I think this really means finding grantees out there that you believe, through your foundation's research, homework, and due diligence, are the ones that are making the most difference in achieving your mission, and then hopefully resourcing and equipping those grantee partners to be as successful as possible, that in a way that most effectively carries out your shared mission. And in many ways, this is what trust-based philanthropy is telling you to do too, because it's not asking your boards or foundations to be indiscriminate about who to fund. Its first principle is, in fact, do the homework or practice. Figure out who you truly believe is going to do the work, the kind of work that makes a difference. And be proactive about that, and do the research. Like that's one of the principles. So all that homework allows you to figure out which grantees you should place your trust in with the grant funding. And I would say that that is a key practice in reducing the risk in your grant making. And once you've made the decision to fund the grantee, there's nothing in a board's fiduciary duties that require the foundation to only engage in short-term restricted project funding, or to require onerous reports, or to require grantees to submit elaborate new proposals for a renewal grant. While it might seem like an exercise of a board member's duty of care to require a short leash on a grantee so that you feel like you have control over what they're doing with the money, would it still be consistent with a board member's duties if they learn that such practices actually hindered the grantee's ability to achieve their mission. And what if most nonprofit leaders shared that, you know, some of the more traditional grant making practices take away from their ability to do their work, and keep them in a starvation cycle of constantly having to submit proposals and reports rather than focusing on their more important work of serving their communities, or don't give them the flexibility to pivot if, say, a global pandemic happened to strike so that they had to shift all their programming. So, you know, what would a board say if, you know, they learned that unrestricted multi-year funding actually allows grantees to build the capacity to more fully execute on their mission and vision, which the foundation happens to share? So, you know, I don't think that trust-based philanthropy puts a foundation or its board more at risk, or at least it doesn't increase the risk of not successfully achieving one's mission or of being irresponsible stewards of the funds. I think the onus is still on the board and the foundation leadership to figure out at the front end who you want to be your grantee partners and who you want to bestow your trust in. But then once you get there, I think it's resourcing them in the way that you think will help them best achieve your shared goals.